A boot swung out and kicked a crust of bread from a child's hands. The little one hit the mud on both knees, fingers scraping after it. A second boy threw himself over the first, taking the next shove in the back. Around them, grown men laughed. A hand grabbed one boy by the collar and lifted him clean off his feet. He didn't cry. He just stared, teeth bared, more animal than child. Then a voice cut across the square. Sharp. Steady. A woman stepped between the men and the children, an old wolfhound growling at her heel. Her name was Ilara Voss, and she was a baker's widow who owned almost nothing. What she did next, with nothing but a broom and a hard look, made 3 grown men back away, cursing and swearing. Why would a poor widow risk everything for 2 strangers' children? Stay with me. Let me back up and tell you how it started, because it didn't start that morning in the square. It started long before, in the cold gray hour before the town of Hollowmere ever woke up. Ilara Voss opened her bakery every day before the sun. That was the only life she knew. Her husband, Tomas, had died 2 winters back, coughing his lungs out through a long, hard season. He left her the oven, the stall, and a mountain of debt. He did not leave her children. That was the one thing she had wanted and the one thing they never got. So every morning she rose alone in the dark. She lit the fire. She kneaded the dough with her sleeves pushed up and her hands raw, and at her feet always lay a great gray wolfhound named Barrow. He was older than the debt and slower than he used to be, but he never left her side. When she walked to the market square with her cart, Barrow walked with her. Now here's the thing about Hollowmere. It was a hard town in a hard corner of the world, up where the frost bit early and stayed late. People there did not have much, and what little they had they held onto with both fists. They were not cruel people, most of them. They were just tired, and tired people learn to look away. That is why nobody helped the 2 children. Ilara first noticed them maybe a month after Tomas died. 2 small boys, filthy, thin as fence rails, living somewhere out past the edge of town where the forest started. Nobody knew where they came from. Nobody claimed them. The older one might have been 7. The younger one 5, maybe less. They moved wrong if you watched them. Too quick, too quiet, they crouched instead of sat. They smelled the air before they ate. The other children in town called them the wolf boys, and the grown folk crossed themselves and steered wide. The whole village stepped around those 2 like they were a hole in the road. But not Barrow. That's the part I want you to remember. The very first morning, that old wolfhound wouldn't stop pulling toward the tree line. He whined. He tugged. And Ilara, who trusted that dog more than she trusted most people, followed him. That's how she found them, tucked under a broken cart, sharing a rind of frozen turnip. 2 boys with eyes too old for their faces. She didn't say anything wise. She didn't make a speech. She just tore a loaf in half and set it down and stepped back, the way you would with a wild thing, and she waited. The older boy watched her for a long time. Then he snatched the bread, split it, and pushed the bigger piece to his little brother before he took a single bite himself. Ilara felt something turn over in her chest when she saw that. A child with nothing, and still the first thing he did was feed someone smaller. After that, it became a ritual. Every dawn, before she sold a single loaf, Ilara set aside 2 portions. She'd carry them to the edge of the square and leave them on the low stone wall. Some mornings the boys were there. Some mornings they weren't, and the bread was gone by the time she came back, and she never knew if they took it or the birds did. She never asked. She never made them thank her. She never once told them to be grateful or to work or to change. She just fed them, season after season. What Ilara did not know, could not have known, was that she was being watched too. Out past the tree line where the pines grew black and close, a man stood every single morning, tall, still. Wrapped in a dark cloak with the hood down so the frost caught in his hair. He never came into town. He never spoke. He just stood at the edge of the trees out of the wind, and he watched the widow feed his children. His name was Cale Draven. And though not a soul in Hollowmere knew it, he was a king. Not a king of men, a king of wolves, the alpha of the old northern pack, the crowned line that had ruled the deep forests since before Hollowmere had a name. But a king can be betrayed same as anybody. His own blood had turned on him, driven him out, scattered his people, and put a price on his head and on the heads of his sons. So the Alpha King had run. He had hidden his cubs in the one place his enemies would never think to look. Among humans, in the dirt at the edge of a poor market town, and every dawn in the shape of a man, he tested the humans of Hollowmere with a single silent question. "Which of you," he asked without a word, "will show my children a scrap of mercy?" For a long time the answer was none. He watched them kicked. He watched them spat on. He watched doors shut. He had begun to believe the answer would always be none, and he had begun, in the cold quiet of his heart, to hate them all for it. Then a poor widow with an old dog set down a loaf of bread and stepped back. Cale Draven did not step out of the trees that day. He did not step out for a very long time. But from that morning on, he watched one human above all the rest. He learned the sound of her cart wheels. He learned the shape of her tired shoulders. He learned that she gave when she had nothing to spare and asked nothing back, and did it whether anyone saw her or not. That last part mattered to him more than she would ever understand, because a king learns fast that most kindness is done for an audience. Hers had none, only him, and he was a secret. So the seasons turned, and the debt on Alara's stall grew heavier, and the frost came early again. And that brings us back to the market square and the boot and the bread in the mud. It happened on a market day, the busy kind, when farmers came down from the hills and the square was full. The two boys had come in too close, drawn by the smell of the ovens, and a group of drovers had decided to have some fun. You know the type. Bored men, a little drunk, looking for something weaker than themselves. They started with insults, then the shoving, then the boot. Alara heard the laughing before she saw it. She came around her stall with a broom still in her hand, and she saw the older boy lifted off his feet by his collar, choking, his little brother clawing at the man's leg. She did not think. That was the truth of it. She did not weigh the cost. She swung. The broom handle cracked across the drover's forearm, and he dropped the boy with a yelp. Alara stepped over the children, put herself between them and the men, and stood there, one poor widow with a broom and a graying dog. Barrow's lips peeled back off his teeth, and out of that old chest came a growl so low it seemed to come up through the ground itself. "Get away from them," Alara said. Her voice didn't shake. The men laughed, but it was a nervous kind now. One of them, the biggest, took a step. Barrow's growl climbed. And behind the men, none of them noticed, the crowd went quiet, because at the edge of the square, past the last stall, a hooded man had come forward 2 steps out of the shadow of an alley and gone very, very still. The big drover looked at the growling dog, and the woman who wouldn't move, and the whole square watching him bully children, and he did the math. He spat on the ground. "Filthy witch," he said. "You'll be sorry you took in wolf spawn." And he turned and shoved off through the crowd, and his friends went with him. The square breathed again. People went back to their business, embarrassed, quick to look away, the way people do. And Alara knelt down in the mud and took the older boy's face in her flour-dusted hands and checked him over for hurt. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of what she said. Because of what a hooded man at the edge of the square finally let himself believe. She took them home. That was the irreversible thing. Up until then, she had fed them at arm's length, out in the open, where it cost her only bread. Now she folded up her stall early, packed the boys into her cart under a blanket with Barrow curled around them, and pulled the whole load back through the frozen streets to her little house behind the bakery. She did it in full view of Hollowmere. Everybody saw. And in a town like that, seeing means talking, and talking means trouble. She didn't care. Or rather, she cared and did it anyway, which is braver. Her house was one warm room and a loft. She sat the boys by the fire and she washed the mud off them, and she found out slowly that the older one was called Rennick and the little one Fen, though it took the better part of an hour to get even that much out of them. They ate like starved things. Rennick still gave Fen the bigger share of everything. When Alara reached to smooth the little one's hair, Fen flinched so hard he knocked over his cup and then looked up at her, terrified, waiting to be hit for it. Nobody had ever not hit him. You could see it in his face. Alara just mopped up the spill and poured him more. "It's all right," she said. "It's only a cup." Something in the older boy, Rennick, watched her do that with an expression she couldn't read. Later, much later, she would understand it had been the closest thing to hope he had let himself feel in a year. She made them a bed in the loft out of every blanket she owned. She put Barrow at the foot of the ladder like a guard. And when they finally slept, both boys curled together nose to nose the way pups do, she stood there in the firelight and looked at them and let herself want, just for one dangerous minute, to keep them. That night the whole town knew the widow Voss had taken the wolf boys in. And out past the tree line, a man in a dark cloak stood in the snow and watched the smoke rise gentle from her chimney. And for the first time in a long and bitter year, the Alpha King let his shoulders come down. His sons were warm. Someone had chosen them. He didn't step out. He wasn't ready and it wasn't safe. But he stood there far longer than he needed to, watching that little house hold the last of his blood, and something that had been clenched inside him for a year finally began to loosen. For a few days it was quiet. I want you to feel how quiet it was, because it matters. The trouble seemed to pass. The drovers moved on to the next town. The gossip settled the way gossip does when there's nothing new to feed it. The boys started to unclench. Fen learned to laugh, a rusty little sound like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. Rennick started helping in the bakery, quick hands good at shaping loaves, and he stopped flinching when Alara came near. One evening near the end of that first calm week, Alara sat down at her own table with a cup of hot cider between her hands, and Barrow's heavy head on her knee, and both boys asleep and safe above her. And she let herself exhale. She thought, for the first time since Tomas died, that maybe the hard part was over. Maybe the world had done its worst and moved on. She sipped her cider and watched the fire and let herself rest. She had no idea what was coming up the road. The knock came just before midnight, not a friendly knock. A fist, hard 3 times. Alara opened the door on the town elder, Master Corwin, and behind him a knot of maybe a dozen men holding torches. The frost hung red in the light of the flames, and Corwin did not shout. That was the frightening part. He was calm and reasonable, and that made it so much worse. "Widow Voss," he said, "you'll hand over the 2 boys." This is where it turns. Because up to this point it had been ugly men and cruel words, and Alara knew how to stand up to those. But this was different. This was the town itself, organized, official, come to her door with a decision already made. This wasn't a fight about pride anymore. This was about survival, and not just the boys' survival. Hers. "They're children," Alara said. "They're not yours to hand over." "There's a rider come up from the coast road," Corwin said. "A lord's man. Says he's hunting 2 boys stolen from a great house, and there's gold for whoever gives them up and a fire for whatever village hides them. You understand me. He named this valley. He'll come here next." Corwin's voice softened, and that was the killing blow. "I've got my own grandchildren to think of, Alara. The whole town against 2 strays that aren't even yours. Give them up. Don't make us take them." Now think about what she was being told. The men who wanted the boys weren't drunken drovers she could scare with a broom. They were a lord's hunters, armed, backed by gold, backed by law, and behind them the threat to burn Hollowmere to the ground. The nature of the whole thing had changed. It wasn't Alara against a few bullets. It was Alara against a hunter she'd never seen, a town that had already surrendered, and a power far bigger than a market square. And here's the thing she didn't know. The thing that made it 1,000 times more dangerous than even Corwin understood. The Lord's man on the coast road wasn't hunting stolen children at all. He was one of the traders from the old pack, wearing a human face, hunting a bloodline. He wasn't there to take the boys back to a great house. He was there to end the royal line for good. Alara didn't know that, but she knew a hunted look when she saw one, and she'd seen it on those two boys the first morning under the cart. So she stood in her own doorway, one poor widow, and she looked at a town full of torches, and she said the only thing she had left to say. No. Just that no. Corwin's face closed up, the men shifted, and behind Alara on the ladder a small voice said, "It's all right." It was Rennick. He'd come down. He stood there in his borrowed nightshirt, 7 years old and already so tired of being hunted, and he looked at Alara with those eyes too old for his face. "We'll go. Don't let them burn your house. We'll go, and you'll be safe." That right there. That's the moment. A little boy who owned nothing, offering to walk into the dark to protect the one person who'd ever been kind to him. Alara felt her whole heart break clean in two. And if that hit you, if you're still with me and feeling this one, do me a small favor and hit that subscribe button, because stories like Alara's are exactly what this channel is built on, and I've got more of them coming. Now stay with me, because everything is about to change. "You are not going anywhere," Alara told Rennick, and she stepped back inside and she barred the door. They came at the door with a log. The first blow shook the frame. Finn started crying up in the loft, that terrible thin sound. Barrow put himself in front of the boys and roared, but a dog can't stop a mob. The second blow cracked the top hinge. Alara grabbed the fire iron, and she absolutely knew, it wasn't going to be enough. She was one woman with an iron and an old dog against a town. The third blow never landed, because that was the night the blood moon rose, and out past the tree line, a king had run out of reasons to stay hidden. The men outside heard it before they saw it. A sound none of them had ever heard, not really, not this close. A wolf's howl, but wrong, too deep, too vast, a sound that came up out of the frozen ground and rattled the teeth in their heads. The torches wavered, the log dropped, and into the red light of the blood moon, out of the dark at the edge of the trees, came something enormous. I'm going to tell you exactly what they saw, because they never forgot it, and neither should you. It came on 4 legs the size of a bear, black as the space between stars, with a coat that drank the torchlight. Its shoulders stood taller than a man. And on its brow, where the fur ran silver, there was a mark like a crown, an old white scar in the shape of points, the mark the northern packs had bowed to for 1,000 years. Its eyes caught the blood moon and threw it back gold. The Alpha King had come for his sons. The mob broke. Of course they did. Grown men who'd felt so brave with their torches and their log ran screaming into the frozen streets, and Master Corwin fell right down on his backside in the snow. But 2 of them didn't run. 2 of them, standing at the back, pulled long knives, and one of them threw back his hood, and his eyes caught the moon and threw it back gold too. The Lord's men, the traitors. They'd been waiting for exactly this, for the king to show himself, and now that he had, they meant to finish the whole royal line in one night. The first traitor shifted, fur bursting out of a human shape, and lunged. The 2 great wolves came together in the middle of the square with a sound like thunder falling downstairs. Alara flung open her broken door and saw it. She should have been terrified, and she was. But she looked at that crowned black wolf tearing into the men who'd come to burn her house, and some deep animal part of her already understood whose children she'd been feeding. The fight was fast and it was brutal, and I'm not going to soften it. The Alpha King was outnumbered 2 to 1, and he was thinner than he should have been, because a father who spends a year making sure his cubs eat first goes hungry himself. The second traitor got in behind him and opened a long red wound across his flank, and the great black wolf staggered and went down on one knee in the snow, and for one awful heartbeat, it looked like the crowned line was going to end right there in a poor widow's front yard. Then Barrow hit the traitor from the side. That old wolfhound, gray at the muzzle, slow in the hips, half-blind in one eye, threw his whole failing body into the throat of a thing 3 times his size. He couldn't win. He knew he couldn't win. He did it anyway for the same reason he'd nosed Alara toward those boys that very first morning. Some hearts just know where they belong. It bought 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. The Alpha King came up off the snow, and there was nothing tired in him now, nothing hungry, only a father with his teeth bared, and he took the traitor who'd hurt Barrow and he ended him. The last one ran. He didn't run far. The king caught him at the edge of the trees, and after that the woods were quiet and the blood moon looked down on a square full of dropped torches guttering out in the snow. Alara ran to Barrow. The old dog was breathing, but it was bad, a wet and ragged sound. She gathered his big gray head into her lap right there in the freezing mud, and she pressed her hands to the wound, and she begged him, "Please, please, you old fool, you stubborn old fool, don't you dare." And Barrow thumped his tail once against the snow and looked up at her with his one good eye, and you could see he was trying to tell her it was all right, that he'd done what he came to do, that he'd found her the family she'd wanted and guarded it to the last, and there was no better way for an old dog to go than that. And the great black wolf came and stood over them both. Up close he was terrifying and he was gentle at the same time, blood on his muzzle and grief in his gold eyes. He lowered his enormous head and he breathed on the old wolfhound, slow, warm, deliberate. Whether it was some magic in the crown line or just one guardian saying farewell to another, Alara never knew, but Barrow's ragged breathing eased. The old dog sighed, long and content, the way he used to sigh by the fire, and then he was still. The 2 boys came out of the house, and they did not run to the widow, and they did not run from the wolf. They ran to the wolf and they buried their faces in his bloody fur, and they said the word Alara had never heard either of them say once in all these weeks. Papa, Papa, Papa. That's when she understood all of it, the tree line, the watching she'd half felt and never named, why the boys moved wrong and smelled the air, whose children she'd fed at the edge of the square, season after season, asking nothing. The blood moon climbed, and where the great black wolf had stood, a man knelt in the snow with his sons in his arms, tall, dark-haired, a long white scar on his brow in the shape of points. He was hurt and he was weeping, and he was, unmistakably, a king. Cale Draven raised his eyes to the poor widow with the dead dog in her lap, and he spoke to her for the first time in all the seasons he had watched her. "I have stood in those trees every morning for a year," he said. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used for kindness in a long time. "I watched 100 people look away from my children. You were the only one who looked at them. You fed my sons when you had nothing and asked for nothing and never knew I saw." He looked down at Barrow, and he bowed his head to the old dog, an actual king bowing to a hound. "And your guardian gave his life for mine. There is no debt in all my kingdom big enough to pay what I owe this house." Alara, kneeling in the snow with her hands full of the dog she'd loved for 15 years, did not ask for gold. She didn't ask for anything. She was who she was, all the way to the bottom. She just looked at those 2 boys clinging to their father, safe, alive, and she said, "You don't owe me. I'd feed them again tomorrow. I'd feed them for nothing till the day I died." And Cale Draven looked at her, the way no man had looked at her since Tomas, maybe the way no man had ever looked at her, and he understood he had found something a king almost never finds. Someone who would have chosen his blood even if there had never been a crown behind it. They buried Barrow at the edge of the trees, at the exact spot where a hooded man had stood every morning for a year, watching over the whole thing. It felt right putting him there on the border between the town and the wild, because that was where the old dog had always lived, one foot in each world, guiding the lost toward the kind. Now here's how it ended, and I'll tell it plain, because it doesn't need dressing up. Chaol Draven did not sweep Alara off to some far mountain hall that night. A king who has learned patience in the cold does not grab. He stayed. He healed. He mended her broken door with his own hands, and he sat at her small table, and he let his sons show her, week by week, the whole story of who they were. And Alara, who had wanted children her whole life and been told by the world she'd have none, found herself with two, and with a man who had watched her be good when no one was looking and loved her for it before he ever said a single word. Master Corwin and the whole of Hollowmere had to reckon with what they'd done that night, and I won't pretend they became saints. But it's a strange thing. A town discovering the strays they stepped around belonged to a king who could have burned them all and chose not to. They fed the boys after that. They fed them well. Fear will do that where kindness wouldn't, and maybe, in a few of them, the shame turned slowly into something better. When the frost broke and spring came up green through the snow, Chaol took Alara's flower-worn hands in his and told her the truth of what her mercy had earned. Not gold. Not a crown, though she'd have that too if she wanted it. He told her his people were scattered and hunted and needed a heart to gather around, and that in a year of watching humankind look away, he had found exactly one heart big enough. Hers. He asked her to be his mate, and the mother his sons had chosen for themselves long before he'd worked up the courage to ask. She said yes. Of course she said yes. But do you know what she asked for? The only thing, the one condition from the woman who never asked for anything. She asked to keep baking. She asked that wherever they went, there'd be an oven and a stall, and bread set aside each dawn for whatever hungry, ragged, overlooked little thing came out of the trees, because there is always another one. And someone has to see them. Chaol Draven, Alpha King of the North, threw back his head and laughed, the first real laugh his sons had ever heard from their father, and he told her the whole kingdom would eat her bread. So that's the story. A poor widow with an old dog and an empty cradle, who fed two children the whole world ignored, and never once knew a crowned wolf stood in the trees, weeping at the sight of the only mercy his sons had ever been shown. It started with a boot kicking bread into the mud. It ended with that same woman feeding a kingdom, with two boys calling her mother, and an old gray dog sleeping under the trees where he'd finally led her home. She gave everything and asked for nothing. And in the end, that turned out to be the one thing in all the world worth a king's whole heart. Rest easy, Barrow. You old fool. You did good.